Okay, hello and welcome everyone to this session of Carbon Net Zero Week, which is brought to you in partnership with iNetwork and YPO. My name is Louis Stockwell. I'm the Connected Procurement and Commissioning Programme Coordinator at iNetwork, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar, or this webinar, one of many webinars today, on the topic of measuring and analysing carbon in our organisations and supply chains. So to discuss this today, I'm really delighted to be joined by two colleagues who recently been doing some really great work on this topic, but from quite different perspectives. So I will introduce our guests in just a moment and let them talk in a bit more detail about their work and projects they've been working on. But just by way of a very quick introduction, it's a real pleasure to be joined by Cecily Church. Cecily is the Guinness Housing Partnership Sustainability Manager. She has years of experience working in both sustainability and the housing sector. And she currently oversees Guinness's retrofit programme and is also working on the Guinness Partnership sustainability strategy as well. So really warm welcome, Cecily. Thank you for joining us. Okay. So we're also really fortunate to be joined by Karthik Suresh today, who is Innovation Director at Amaresco. Amaresco is a leading provider of energy solutions globally. And over the past few years, Karthik has been involved with the development of a number of solutions for kind of management and reporting of energy and emissions. So really warm welcome again to you both. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll kick off with your presentations in just a moment, but just a couple of very quick housekeeping items from me before we begin. So for anybody watching this, you should be able to see there's a chat box on the side of your screen where you can take part in the conversations today. We really would encourage you to do that. Just to say that this session is pre-recorded, so unfortunately we won't be able to take live questions at the end. But if you do put any questions that you have for the speakers or about this topic in the chat box, myself or the YPO team will be really happy to follow up after Net Zero Week and broker any introductions with the panelists if that would be helpful. Just a couple of other things. So you should be able to see a menu icon as well at the top of your screen to navigate back to the Net Zero event agenda, where you can see all the upcoming webinars and sessions. And you should also see a link at the bottom of your screen where you can do the same and have a look and register for those webinars. Finally, just to say we're always really eager to spread the word about these. So please do share any links to sessions, etc., with colleagues that you think would benefit. Share the resources, and if you're on social media, on Twitter as well, then you can join the conversation at hashtag YPONetZero and hashtag iNetworkNetZero. That's enough from me. I think let's just dive straight into this topic of carbon measurement and analysis. And what I'd like to do, I think, is to hand over to Cecily first to tell us a little bit about some of the carbon emissions and measurement and analysis work that's recently been undertaken at the Guinness Partnership. And what some of the key priorities are looking ahead as well. So over to you, Cecily.
Hi everyone, and thanks very much for having me along. I'm Cecily. I'm the Sustainability Manager for the Guinness Partnership. I'm going to be talking about Guinness's emissions, how we quantify them, and what we're starting to do about reducing them. So just a quick overview of the Guinness Partnership and who we are. So Guinness is one of the UK's larger housing associations. We've got in total about 65,000 properties, of which about 54,000 are directly managed by ourselves. And they are spread all over England, really. We've got large concentrations in the northwest, particularly around Manchester and Cheshire, but we have a spread all across the southwest, around London, on the south coast, so pretty much everywhere. And they're found in over 150 local authorities across England. And for that, we've got 8 offices, and then on top of that, 36 regional hubs. So emission-wise, there are a lot of them, really. In terms of how we think about the sources of our emissions, we've got broadly these 5 areas. So firstly, we've got the office energy, our electricity and heating of the offices across the country that we own or lease. We've got our operations, so that's our fleet, but also the maintenance and construction work that we do. We've got our properties, as I've mentioned, and then we've got emissions from other resources that we're using, for example, our water use and our waste production. And then we've got our entire supply chain and their associated emissions. So I'm going to go through these in a little bit more depth of what we're doing to quantify these emissions and thinking about how to tackle them. Firstly, because it's probably the most straightforward, we've got our offices and our operations. And both of these, for a while now, we've had some level of data collection on them because we are purchasing the energy for these directly. So for our fleet, we have monitoring equipment that track the mileage and the fuel consumption. And for our offices, we have our energy bills, but we're also, we've recently put in live monitoring equipment so that we can see in real time how much energy they're using. Obviously, over the last year, it's been a little lower than it has been previously, same with fleet and business travel, but we're setting a baseline of 19 to 20 to compare how much we use going forward. And business travel, similarly, we track all of the journeys that are made, and the companies that we work with on it give us an indication of mileage associated with that we can then estimate emissions from. We have some ways already of reducing the emissions from our offices and operations. We have solar panels on 2 of our biggest offices, and we have electric charging points just being put in at a couple of our offices, and also we are moving to electric fleet. So we've just started trialling some electric vehicles. The charging points are interesting in that they are increasing our office emissions, but hopefully over time will decrease our overall emissions as we move towards greener vehicles. The biggest focus until now has really been for the sustainability team on our properties, because we have so many of them and they contribute such a huge amount of our emissions. So based on our emissions excluding our supply chain, our properties account for over 90% of the emissions. That's primarily from gas boiler usage, but also the electricity. And in terms of quantifying our property emissions, we don't yet have a way of monitoring live how they're performing, but we do have several proxies for determining the emissions. So we rely on energy data primarily from EPCs or from energy data on our asset management system that will give us a SAP score and an environmental impact score. Our main focus has been on SAP, but that is more of a measure of the cost of running a property versus the emissions from a property. So environmental impact is focused on the emission side of things, and the EPC, the Energy Performance Certificate, gives us an estimate of the carbon dioxide emissions for that property. So that's the figure that we've been looking at to estimate our property emissions. And we are now just bringing in an energy data tool that's helping us to interrogate that data further. So it's helping us to fill gaps where there are any. For example, we don't have a full EPC for all of our properties, so there's scope to improve the data quality and completeness. And then it also is helping us to identify where the highest emission properties are and what measures we can take to reduce the emissions from those properties. For example, if they're very uninsulated or they have a particularly carbon intensive fuel source like oil or coal, then we can identify those ones and see what measures we could take to improve insulation and heating to reduce those emissions. And we are just starting to investigate the live monitoring options. We have already got some smart thermostats installed that track in real time what the emissions for, or what the heating use from that property is, and from that we can extrapolate the emissions associated with it, which is an exciting area. We obviously have to be very careful with it because we don't want to infringe upon our residents' privacy, but it will be very interesting to see how the properties perform in practice versus how they are assumed to perform on the EPC or on the energy data that we hold on them, because there's likely to be some level of discrepancy between the two. So that's an exciting area. There's also possible options, particularly for new builds, around digital twins and modelling that property and then seeing how it's performing in practice. But this is very early days for us, so it's a consideration more than something we've implemented yet. So more widely, there are all of the emissions associated with our supply chain. So not the emissions that we directly generate ourselves from our stock or our offices or operations, but the emissions, it's termed as upstream or downstream of us. So everything associated with the construction and material production for our new properties and all of our maintenance work, and then afterwards what happens with the construction itself and then the disposal of materials down the line. All of these have a lot of emissions associated with them. We build hundreds of properties per year and maintain thousands upon thousands. So this is an area that we're concentrating on increasingly, but it is quite early days for us at the moment because it is just such an enormous area. So we started to work with our procurement team to begin to think about how, when we are tendering, we building questions around whether our suppliers will be monitoring their emissions, whether they're doing anything to reduce their emissions. We're also starting to speak to our contractors that we have in place already around what they're doing in this area. And it goes that step beyond fitting energy efficient measures or building to energy efficient standards to then think about how the contractors themselves are performing. So yes, a new area, but an exciting one. So just to wrap up, how we're bringing it all together. So over the last few months, we have been working on our carbon footprint to get that overarching picture of how we're performing. As I've said, it's a particularly tricky year over the last year to set as a baseline, but it at least gives us something, and then we can backtrack for years before that as well. And it will be interesting to see how things pan out over the longer term too, because we, for example, are not due to go back to our offices really for most of our staff until September, and then we're going to be trialling a hybrid working practice. So I don't know how long it'll be, if ever, that we really go back to how things were before the pandemic. So it might be an overarching shift. Will be interesting to track and see what effect that does have on our emissions. But that's what we're trying to do at the moment, put in place a carbon footprint that does track all of the aspects of our emissions, and crucially put in place systems that enable us to gather that data, because as a big organisation that is very scattered, it can be difficult to identify who actually holds the data, where it's stored, how regularly it's provided to us, and then pull it together. So over the shorter term, we've got targets set around gathering all of that data, ensuring that it's complete, filling in any gaps if we do identify them, and putting in place those procedures for ensuring that the data is regularly collated. And then we'll use that for two purposes. One, to then work out where we can start reducing our emissions, particularly on our offices and operations side, because that's the area that we've not yet done much with. With our houses, we have an existing programme of carbon reduction works, but obviously with net zero carbon in 2050, we have a huge amount to do in that area as well. And then secondly, around reporting on our emissions. So to date, as an entire organisation, we haven't had to report on our overall emissions, but we anticipate having to in the near future. So we're making sure that we're geared up in readiness for that. So that's a very quick overview of emissions, how we're quantifying them, and what we're going to be doing with the results at the Guinness Partnership. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, Cecily, for that presentation. It was really, really insightful. Great to see some of the really great projects being undertaken at Guinness as well. So what I'd like to do now is, just before we go to the Q&A questions, introduce Karthik to tell us a little bit about this topic from a different perspective, from a perspective of energy solutions supplier, Amaresco. So Karthik, if you could tell us a little bit about some of the projects that you've been involved with, some of those solutions you've been working on, that would be really helpful, I think. So over to you.
So my name is Karthik Suresh and I work at Ameresco, a energy services company that's headquartered in Boston. Thanks very much for inviting me to this session. And I'm going through decarbonising strategies that we're using with some large organisations and the sort of challenges and learning that we've gained over the way. So when it comes to measurement, analysis and decarbonisation, this is a space that we've been working for 15 years now. Since around 2005-06, when carbon started to be talked about as an issue of concern for organizations. Change slides. Very quickly, Amaresco is a clean tech integrator and developer of renewable energy assets. We've invested a lot of money in projects. We've developed over $10 billion worth of projects. We've raised finance of around $3.5 billion for these. And we have our own portfolio of generation. So we're quite experienced at creating large, complex projects, which increasingly these days have a combination of technologies in them. So all the way through from large-scale CHPs, incorporating battery energy storage, and also advanced microgrid controls. And to try and get these levels of projects, you're talking about a lot of investment and a huge amount of decision-making throughout an organization to try and create the business case for these sorts of projects. There's an emerging area here called energy as a service, and we've just been ranked number 1 in this space. Now, a lot of the work that I do is with large organizations, and over the last few years, we've been working with them on developing strategies and ways to think through the decarbonization challenge. And one way we sort of boiled all this down was to look at something called a net zero strategy equation. So it's quite simple. It's A minus B minus C equals D. If we start at the other end, D is net zero. Now, we don't quite know what net zero means, and it's defined differently, and we're working towards starting to get a definition of net zero that is acceptable to people. But when we have that, whatever zero means in the context we're working in, that'll be our target. We're going to end up at net zero in 2050. At the other end, most organizations start off with A, which is what are our actual emissions right now. That's the data collection and measuring activity that requires us to go from how much electricity or gas we're using through to the emissions that we have right now. And then there will be plans that businesses have, business as usual plans that will reduce those carbon emissions, and there'll be organic reductions as well. And organizations will need to set a trajectory that they're going to follow to reach net zero and publish that information. And then we started with, okay, given where you are right now and what your business as usual plans are, where are you going to end up? What's the variance against the target that you need to head towards? And that gives you a gap, and then you need more actions to fill that gap. And there are emissions reduction measures with a variety of options. So this essentially is the journey that most organizations have to go through over the next 15, 20 years. And many of them are that starting point of A, actual emissions. Now, when we've talked about measurement then to organizations, there's been a story emerging, and it starts really with saying, okay, emission sources there's quite a large number of them. Many organizations are familiar with electricity and gas, that's fairly well controlled. But when you look at a variety of emission sources, then the number of things you need to collect goes up by a factor of 6 to 10. So if you have 30 sites, for example, about 300 emission sources, ranging from LPG and propane and a variety of scope 3 data source you need to get. If you're a larger organization, this will be from sites all over the world with a variety of reporting formats. You'll have some suppliers who give you portals where you can download information. Other information comes in emails. Some information is still in paper and needs to be transcribed. All that information is flowing into an organization to busy stakeholders who are distributed all over the place. The accounts teams, for example, might pick up the finance-related pieces, but not necessarily the numbers you need for emissions reporting, like litres or kilowatt hours and so on. And there is a task that's emerged, where someone needs to collect the information, go through it and make sure it's correct and complete, and then use it to and combine that consumption information with emissions factors to analyze and present the information in a way that's useful for decision makers and wider stakeholders. But if you run a company and you're on board, you're not going to issue that information publicly till it's gone through some sort of audit process, and there's some assurance of what you're doing is valid. And once you have that, you can set targets or refine your targets and then go around the cycle again. And hopefully, as you go through with this information, you'll be able to reduce your emissions over time. And organizations need a delivery team to do this, and systems and processes to make all this happen. Now, what we found was over the last couple of years, a lot of organizations started with the analysis and presenting insights piece, which is the question of what sort of systems are out there, what kind of tools can we buy or implement that'll help us do the analysis. But the really big pain point in this process actually is all the rest of it. It's the collection and the verification, the checking, and getting to the point where you have a massive messy data that's converted into clean data that you can actually use for reporting that is auditable and able to be used for decision making. So when we realized that a few years ago, we started building a toolkit around that, a flexible one to help our stakeholders work with this data. And this is the kind of thing that it helps you do at the end of it. So we start off with, okay, where are all the emission sources? Do we have a list of them? Do we know where they are? What are the consumption factors associated with them? What are the underlying units? Can we understand those units using a variety of metrics? Can we rank them in order so we know what scope 1, 2, 3 measures are across the various sites and which ones have the greatest impact? Can we do things like intensity metrics and comparisons? Because increasingly we're looking at 3 C's. You're looking at cost, consumption, and carbon for decision making. And you might find, for example, you have a site that has very high consumption and is quite high on cost, but the carbon number is 0 because, for example, it's powered by hydro or something that is defined as low carbon. So would you then make the decision to shift more production to that low carbon plant versus one that had a similar cost profile but was located in a state that had a very high carbon intensity? So having those 3 sets of numbers helps you make decisions about where you would allocate resources to minimize carbon in addition to the consumption cost calculations we would have been doing so far. Now, what we've also found is that the information you put out needs to be auditable. And our system, again, has been through audit a couple of times with one of the big 4 accountants. And they've said things like, the toolkit we're creating is effective, it's efficient, and has no material errors. And one of the points about this toolkit is we haven't bought new system software to do it. We're using existing toolkits, primarily based on Microsoft and the Office 365 framework that organizations already have. So very low friction to go from what you have to create something that's actually quite useful and efficient. And we've gone through this learning process to say, actually, we can create a workflow that does its job. Now, if you can get all this information together, then what kind of projects can you do? So this is an example of a school project we have. It's about $10 million, and you can see it has a range of technologies in there: battery energy storage, rooftop solar, carport solar, and a geothermal energy generation system. And these kinds of projects are quite complex. They're long-term, and they require investment by organizations to buy into the idea that you can decarbonize your facilities over 15, 20 years. So how does this kind of stuff go ahead? Well, to take action on emissions, decision makers have to figure out a whole bunch of things. They have to see what impact their choices will make on their reportable carbon emissions. And so when you think about that, you need to look at things like location-based and market-based emissions. What are the actual emissions on site, given the physical wires and connection of fuel and so on that's being burnt on your site? And what can you report using tools like contractual tools or offsets, and how do you mix and match those 2 things to give you a clear picture of what your emissions are? That's actually quite a complex argument to make at senior levels, but it needs to be made. And organizations that are leading in this space right now are finding ways to tell a narrative around how they're addressing both aspects of this, how they're reducing their emissions using contractual instruments perhaps in the short term, but moving to longer term, location-based physical absolute reductions in emissions. And another interesting thing we found in the last year or so in having discussions is, if you look at the barriers to taking action, which typically come down to there is no business case, and we don't know what to do. Those are two things that typically tend to stop organizations from taking focused action on this. We found that the number of drivers have increased massively. So when it comes to regulation, there is more regulation around now that is asking organizations to do something in this space, even as targeted reporting and monitoring and audits. Customers are asking their supply chains to demonstrate their progress. The leadership is listening to what's happening in the market, and we find that board members are asking their organizations what's going on and what sort of action they're taking. Employees are choosing organizations based on their commitment to sustainability. You have sector-level agreements happening in various areas, and really interestingly and important, investors are funneling money into companies that have a good environmental, social, and governance story in preference to ones that don't, and that trend appears to be accelerating. Now, the journey that most organizations are going through needs to end up with them making better decisions about decarbonising their portfolio. So we start at one end with data, and there's a range of data you can collect. Typically, we focus for decision-making purposes on data that is auditable, so related to financial information. But you take the data, you convert that into something that is information that's understandable by a range of stakeholders, and you have to create different kinds of information packs because internal stakeholders who make operational decisions on what to turn on, what to turn off, will need different stuff from an investor audience who are trying to figure out whether or not your business has a license to operate and is sustainable in the long term. And when you're able to put things together, you can essentially create knowledge that helps you make wiser decisions. And we found that, again, tools and systems have to be built around the needs of individual organizations. This package you can see on the screen, for example, there's a core capability which is around providing information for emissions. How much are you emitting? What's the summary? What are the performance metrics? But we're also finding that the same information is going to be used to look at projects and rank different opportunities and allocate capital in one direction versus another. We're seeing this is driving acquisition strategy. If you're a company and you see yourself being able to decarbonize by acquiring a specific sector, specific kinds of organizations, then you want to bring that into your strategy. We find we need to model carbon trajectories. What's organic reduction going to look like, and what are additional activities you need to do over and above the organic reductions, the decarbonizing the grid, for example, to meet your targets. And then finally, how can you justify all this? There's a really big need to make sure that whatever you're doing is grounded in the data and is an evidence-based and thoughtful approach to decision making. So we've been doing quite a lot of work in this space. My contact details are on there, and there are a few more webinars and demos and white papers and so on that we have. But there's a really interesting and exciting space where I think we're seeing a lot of collaboration between organizations who are trying to share knowledge and best practice around how to go through what is really a complex transformation task for everyone, where we don't know all the answers. We're trying to work our way through a balanced and reasonable approach to trying to help these organizations transform and become greener and more sustainable.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Karthik, for that really insightful presentation there. We do have time now for a few questions, which we've pre-agreed with our panelists, and hopefully we'll have some good discussions coming out of this. But if there are questions from the audience as well, please do remember that you can put them in the chat box, and we can follow up broker introductions with our panelists after Net Zero Week if that's useful. But yeah, let's just drive straight into the Q&A then. I think one thing that's come out of a lot of conversations that we've been having at our network with our partners is around the kind of move towards the importance of understanding and action against Scope 3 emissions specifically. I just wondered for non-specialists in the audience, including myself in that, whether maybe Cecily, you could just outline really the difference between Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions and why that's an important distinction.
Absolutely, yes. So I like to think of Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions as Scope 1 being your direct emissions, Scope 2 being your direct energy usage but indirect emissions, and Scope 3 as being indirect energy usage and energy emissions. So in terms of how actual uses break down into that, the Scope 1 emissions are primarily around where you're burning fuel yourself. So that might be a gas boiler, for an office or for a home, or it could be a vehicle with an internal combustion engine. Your scope 2 emissions primarily are electricity, and your scope 3 emissions are really everything else, any other activities that you've got going on that have emissions associated with them, either because they're products that have emissions associated with their production, or because you are carrying out activities that have emissions associated with the vehicles or tools that are being carried out, or because there are emissions associated with waste further down the line. So it's a useful distinction for seeing what you have the most control over personally, but also then for seeing the scale of those emissions, because scope 3 emissions, while they're less directly associated with you as an individual organisation, they're often a really significant contributing factor. So, for example, if Guinness were to build a property, the emissions associated with the production of that property and then the disposal further down the line would be scope 3 emissions, and they're likely to exceed the energy usage of a highly efficient property during its lifespan. A slight complication with the likes of a housing association is that we have these properties, but so they are almost our direct emissions, but the energy usage of the properties actually classes as scope 3 emissions, because we aren't the ones using the energy ourselves. It would be our influence to do so.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thanks. That's really helpful, actually. And just out of interest, really, I guess, where would you say Guinness are on that journey, on that scale, kind of understanding and action against scope 1, 2, and 3? Do you feel like, well, I don't know. Yeah, I'll let you describe that in your own words.
I think it's a little bit of a mix across the board, really. I feel that we have a fairly good grasp of our scope 1 emissions, because we understand where our offices are and what levels of heating they're consuming. And similarly with our scope 2 emissions, we know the electricity use. We have more room for improvement of just refining that and actually ensuring that data is gathered and verified on a very regular basis. But I would say broadly we're there with that. Similarly with our fleet, we've got a very good grasp of it. The scope 3 emissions, then, it's a real mix. The sustainability team has had a big focus on properties, on our existing properties, for the duration of the sustainability team's existence. So we do have pretty good data on our properties, and we do understand broadly where the higher emitting properties are and the kind of measures that we need to take around them. But it's that much wider understanding of scope 3 that we're really just scratching the surface of at the moment. So we are starting to engage with our contractors and thinking about our tender processes, how we ensure that from the outset of bringing contractors in, they are reporting their emissions to us. And we are trying to look at our broader impacts of water and waste that also come under our scope 3 emissions. But it's really early days. The positive thing about scope 3 emissions is that in almost all cases, one organisation's scope 3 emissions are another organisation's scope 1 or 2 emissions. So in theory, if everybody is working towards getting their scope 1 and 2 emissions in very good order, then we should, when we're able to share that information better between organisations, all have a good grasp of our scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I didn't even think about that, but yeah, that makes sense, right? If everyone knows their own emissions, then as long as we share that data well enough, then that's going to be helpful, isn't it? But I'd like to bring Karthik in at this point. I mean, obviously we know Amaresco work with loads of organisations around the world and work on large projects as well. And just thinking about that understanding, I guess, and thinking about how mature organisations are in their understanding of scope 1, 2, and 3. We know that's really important, right? If we're going to take effective action to reduce emissions and towards sustainability. So I just wondered, from your experience working with different organisations, different projects around the globe, what do you think some of the main barriers are to achieving that understanding? Oh, I think you might be on mute, Karthik.
So we have run a number of sessions with organisations, just trying to find from their point of view what they're struggling with. And I think we've discovered a few things. The first one is that the carbon management measurement reporting task is a new activity. It's something that requires time and resource and knowledge and experience to do. And many existing managers organizations are understaffed. And they might add somebody who has a role and then give them a huge amount of data collection work to do that then ties up all of their time and doesn't leave much time for strategy and communication and trying to talk to other parts of the organization what's going on. So there's kind of two things that the organizations that are successful at this are doing. One is seeing the chief sustainability officer role as an important part at board level and senior level. So you've got somebody who's actually thinking about things strategically and seeing why you would go about collecting this carbon data. What does it actually mean for the organization and how it's going to do things in the future? And they put the resources in place to make sure that collection of data task can be done. Because the easy part, if you have clean data, analyzing and working out your emissions is actually fairly straightforward. It's the collection on the one hand that's difficult, and the socialization, the kind of talking about other people at the other end, that's a bit of a challenge. And where organizations are on this journey right now, I think, is they are getting to the point where they're starting to collect Scope 1, Scope 2 data. That's pretty straightforward. Scope 3 is a bit more complicated. And people aren't quite sure exactly what to collect and why to collect it and what to do with it once they have it. So on the one hand, we have organizations that essentially have a list of all their Scope 2 emissions, Scope 3 emissions, which might include double counting and a couple of questions around, well, how do you actually add that up and what are our emissions? And then you have, at the other end, requirements coming out from the UK government in particular about what to report under various regulation. So I think just trying to figure out how you collect information, know what your Scope 3 numbers are, and then know how to put them together for the needs of the stakeholders you're working with is the kind of activity that organizations are trying to figure out how to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you echo that from a Guinness perspective, Cecily?
Definitely, yes. I think that the point around resourcing really resonates, and it does feel like a very exciting time when there is just so much more interest in sustainability. It's really exploded. So we've seen it at Guinness from our chief executive right the way down through to every level of the organisation. Our sustainability team has people coming to us asking about what we're doing, asking about what they can do. And so it's a positive time, but the flip side of that is that it is time consuming, and there has been an explosion of the work required, particularly as we've got all of that coming internally, but we've also got more and more demands coming from local and national government for reporting and from insurers and lenders. So we're seeing a lot more demand, and we are a small sustainability team for a big organisation. So it's tricky. It does, as has been said, take an awful lot of time to find the right people, gather that information, collate it all, clean it up, put it into a good format, and then be sure that you are covering everything, that it is all reflective of the entire organisation, because as soon as you miss something out, then it's then future years aren't directly comparable with that year. So it's a big challenge, but I think that we are at the start of this explosion of interest and action, and I think that coming out of that we will have more knowledge sharing, more resource, more emphasis on this area, and a recognition of the difficulty of gathering it and the solutions needed to be able to put good systems in place. It's something that our sustainability team are really working on at the moment, to have those streamlined systems so that in future years we're not scrabbling around trying to identify exactly who it is within our fleet team who might be able to provide us with the right information. We know that who it is, and they know how to provide it to us in a more streamlined way.
Yeah, I think that point around knowledge sharing, upskilling, and skills is definitely something that be keen to pick up on. I think we'll have a question on that later. And I was just before we move on to that, though, I was just thinking about some of the sort of supply chain engagement stuff. I think we both touched on, particularly around Scope 3 emissions. And I'm just wondering how, I mean, maybe Cecily, from a housing perspective, whether the conversations that you're having with suppliers are starting to change, particularly as you're looking more towards Scope 3. Does that kind of have a knock-on effect on conversations with suppliers, thinking around contract management and things like that?
Yes, definitely. And we're trying to get it in at the earliest possible stage. So that's why we're working with procurement on our tender documents and processes, so that from the outset, any new contractor we have knows the score with Guinness, that they will have to, as a minimum, report on their emissions, and then hopefully go above and beyond that and demonstrate how they're actually reducing those emissions as well. But it's absolutely something that we can signal to our contractors on, that is something that we take seriously and they will need to report to us. And yeah, increasingly we're engaging with our existing contractors on it as well. I think for the sustainability team, it's a little easier because the contractors we're working with are those already involved in that space. So we're working with insulation installers, low carbon heating installers. So they've already got this in mind. And there are interesting thoughts around the embodied carbon of insulation, for example, and just making sure that something we're putting in does actually save carbon over the course of its lifespan, rather than having production and disposal emissions that actually exceed the emissions that we would expect to save by reducing energy use in the property when that insulation is in place. And then particularly around the heating side of things, we're looking to increase the number of air source heat pumps that we install, because they are one of the better heating options for reducing both emissions, but also keeping running costs for our customers low. But with heat pumps specifically, there are concerns around the refrigerant, because they have very high global warming potential. So while they're not carbon dioxide, their equivalent contribution to global warming is higher than carbon dioxide, even if they don't survive in the atmosphere so long. So just being very careful around what refrigerants there are, and ensuring that they're disposed of well when the products reach the end of life is some of the conversations that we're starting to have in this area. But we're trying to take a holistic view as well, just by ensuring that we do keep the social and obviously the economic aspects part of it as well, because obviously we do ultimately have to be cost competitive in how we run the organisation. And then first and foremost, we're a customer-facing organisation with a social purpose. So we have to incorporate the environmental aspect without losing sight of the impact we're having on our residents and the service that we're providing to them.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks. Really, lots of really important points. I think we do have sessions in Net Zero Week around that kind of environmental social value and tying that into procurement, and also around some of the product switching and recyclable materials and how we can work with suppliers on that. So if people are interested in that stuff, then definitely check out those sessions as well. I'm keen to get Karthik's thoughts on this point as well, around how conversations are changing really between suppliers and between large public organisations, or any large organisations really. I mean, from an energy services perspective, have you noticed that, as we're seeing more legislation and more social pressure towards sustainability, are those conversations changing, would you say?
I think so. We could look at this in sort of two ways almost. So in the private sector, we're seeing a couple of quite interesting trends. There are some organizations that are really going all out when it comes to deploying technology. They have business cases because of what they do that line up for energy technology, for battery storage, for renewable generation, and where they can make a business case for a project that is between even 7 to 10 years, they will go ahead and spend their own money and make it happen. So that's one thing. We're seeing some organizations really leading the way on project development. Now, for other organizations that are taking a commercial view to some extent around projects and they have to try and get stakeholders to buy in, there's two interesting changes again that are happening. The first one is investors are pushing money towards companies that have a credible sustainability narrative. And if you're raising a large amount of say, bond financing or market financing, there's a very clear link between the evidence you can put forward for your sustainability strategy and the rate you get on that money. And we're seeing clients saving $2-3 million on the cost of funds just on this particular narrative alone. Now, if you know what you're doing on sustainability as an organization and you have these projects underway, it also means you can go out and get grant funding. So the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund, for example, right now has about 289 million available for organizations through a series of phases. And one of the application windows was last year in summer 20. 39 projects were approved. We got 2 through for about 2 million. And the main thing about getting those projects was you have to have an idea what you're going to do. You need to know why what you're doing is going to be more sustainable than an alternative. And then the extra costs, essentially the additional costs of selecting the best and the greenest solution can be part funded through these schemes. But in order to put your case together for that story, which can be a little bit complicated, you need to know what you're doing. And so for organizations that have put in the effort and the investment in creating a pipeline of projects, understanding what the base case is and what the most sustainable things they can do, there is money out there. And I think that's one of the things that private sector organizations have to try and do. They have to be able to liberate the strategic thinking time for their senior teams and the engaged managers to go out and see these sources of value, because essentially all the work they're doing is not just additional cost. It actually creates a huge amount of value as long as you're able to go out and get that. Now, in the public sector, I think we've almost seen more engagement. Everybody really wants to do something on sustainability. And there's lots of ideas and lots of projects and a huge amount of engagement. But the thing that stopped the public sector from moving forward has been a lack of clarity on the rules and the procurement rules in particular around how they should go ahead. So just on the 5th of June, a public procurement notice came out that from the 1st of October 21, public sector organizations, central government and so on, who are putting out contracts for over 5 million to suppliers will need to ask them for a carbon management plan, which quite interestingly includes Scope 1, Scope 2, a subset of Scope 3 emissions. And it basically says, we need a plan from you. We need to know how you're going to move towards net zero by 2050. And we need some information on your emissions and a credible presentation that you will then publish on your website. And that is, I think, a very clear statement which will ripple through the public sector chain, because if you have large organizations going for bigger contracts, 5 million plus, who need to do this, then they will use procurement to ask their suppliers, contractors to also comply with that. So that's quite interesting, I think. I mean, this month, that particular decision and procurement notice will perhaps unlock a lot more movement in the public sector, because this is what they've been asking for the last 2 or 3 years, just clarity on what the rules are that they should apply to go ahead and buy greener products.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks, Karthik. Just conscious of time, and I think we've got time for a couple more questions. I'd just like to go back to something that I think you both touched on in previous answers, which is around some of the kind of skills and education and knowledge that's out there, and how we can share that and how important that is for decarbonisation. I'm just wondering, from a kind of public sector or housing perspective, Cecily, to what extent do you think that we've kind of got the knowledge and the skills that are required? I mean, I think you kind of answered that a bit, that it would always be nice to have more, right? And I think more would be helpful. But I don't know, what's your take on that? Are the skills there, and how can we make more? How can we upskill people and share that knowledge more?
Yes, absolutely. There could always be more. But I think that progress has been made, but there is still a way to go. So, yes, as I've said, there's a lot more attention to this area, and conversations going on around how we do have the information and how we do ensure that we have the skills in-house. And I think that there is, in social housing, from what I've seen, growing appetite for that recognition of greater resource needed and requirements both in-house and from our suppliers and contractors to have resource dedicated to sustainability broadly, but carbon reporting in particular. I think that the biggest challenge does come down to procurement, and our wider supply chain has been said. I think that something we've seen with the tenders that come through is that they cover such a broad spread. And as Karthik's mentioned, there is so much that you could potentially report on that each time it feels like from our sustainability team there's a rush to brush up on your knowledge of, just to pick one example, electric estate management tools or polystyrene bead insulation, whatever it might be, that there's an endless amount of specialist knowledge that you could have. So I think that the three areas that can help with that are around having that broad level understanding in-house, and particularly within the sustainability team, but also in the procurement team. And we've been doing working closely with colleagues generally around broader sustainability training, but providing them with advice, training, information, support on how they can assist with the whole sustainability agenda. Then it's around ensuring that our supply chains do also have that knowledge and understanding themselves, so they can report it to us and they can verify how they're reporting it. And thirdly, it's around sharing knowledge and just having conversations with others in the sector. And I think that the social housing sector is, from what I've seen, in a particularly positive space here, because there's an awful lot of collaboration between different housing associations and with local authorities as well. There are a lot of different national and regional sustainability groups and housing groups that really do collaborate and have that honest conversation about what's working and what's proving a real challenge and how that's being overcome. So I think that is going to be really valuable as we try to continue to upskill.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you. And finally, Karthik, on that same point, I mean, I guess in theory, would it be fair to say that the private sector is maybe slightly less, slightly less open sometimes to knowledge sharing, although we know that in the public sector as well, we talk a lot about knowledge sharing and collaboration, and sometimes, we fall short there as well. But I mean, from an Amaresco perspective, what role can organisations like yours play in that upskilling and knowledge sharing in this space, would you say?
I suppose the thing with the private sector is quite often you don't want to say things like, well, we don't know how to do this. That's part of the reluctance to go in and enter into conversation where you're seen as an expert. But I actually think that's quite old-fashioned these days, because the nature of the technology we have and the way you can collaborate, nobody's done this decarbonisation transition before. We don't have established models or expertise in how to do this in the right way. What we can do is have, transparent conversations and figure out how best to approach any given situation for an organization with the people involved and the way in which they're working on things. And we found that's actually a more successful way of going about this. It's much more a team-based approach. And we find that if there is, for example, a sustainability manager at an organization, and we can have a conversation about what they're trying to achieve and bring in expertise from their own supply chains and our resources, then you're much more likely, I think, to create a collaborative working relationship to address these challenges. I don't think an arm's length kind of almost sales type approach is the right way to is the right way to work on this problem, because it's a bit too big really to mess about with. We need to be able to have fairly transparent conversations about what's the best thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it needs collaboration between private and public sectors, isn't it? An issue this large, definitely. So yeah, we're just about out of time, but I'd be keen to get sort of final takeaways from the conversation from you both. I mean, I think most people watching this will be either involved with kind of measurement and analysis of emissions, or at least interested in it in their organisations. So I just wanted to ask, really, in a few sentences, maybe, if you have any kind of words of advice or tips or words of encouragement for people that are working in this space. I don't know if Cecily, you'd like to go first on that.
Well, I would just say for organisations that haven't begun on this yet but are potentially interested in it, that I really would highly recommend starting now, partly because I think it will just become a requirement in future. And as Karthik said, there are real benefits to it as well for the organisation, but there's going to be growing imperatives from national and regional government, from investors, from insurers across the board, and then probably internal reporting too. And it does take a while, especially to begin with. There is no very easy way around that initial gathering, so don't underestimate how long it will take to start putting those processes in place for having that data gathered, and for then cleansing it and assessing it. But similarly, either whether you are about to start or haven't yet started or underway already, don't be disheartened. I think something is better than nothing. It gives you a starting point. And as I mentioned before, if your scope 1 and 2 emissions can be somebody else's scope 3 emissions, then it all contributes to that global picture ultimately of exactly where we are with our emissions. So better to start now and have something than to wait until it can be perfect in due course.
Yeah, fantastic, thank you. And Karthik, same question to you. Final thoughts on this?
I agree with what was said there, really, because that first task of just the enormity of the data collection and putting all that stuff together is the thing that tends to overwhelm people when they're starting this project. Now, I mean, that's one of the reasons why we've spent a bit of time on trying to work in that area, because you can't do what's important until you've gotten over the hurdle of how to collect information. And again, I think there's lots of expertise out there. We're happy to share what we've learned around that space. But I think what is really useful, and where sustainability managers, energy managers and directors need to get to, is saying, okay, we've got the data sorted, we understand where we are right now, what are we going to do next? Because what are we going to do next is a series of decisions that we're finding involve stakeholders from across the organization. So you can't, for example, just give a operations manager some energy data and say, now go away and make everything better. What tends to happen is that data then tells you need capital investment somewhere. That requires finance to step in. That requires you to think about how that money is going to compete with other sources and so on. So essentially, the organizations we're finding that are making real changes in here are using data as a way to have conversations across their organizations with key stakeholders to create a way to make decisions. And yesterday I had a conversation with somebody, and they said, okay, in their organization they have a policy. Any sustainability energy project that has a payback of under 10 years has to go to the board. The board has to make a decision on it within 3 months. And that's a very simple way of saying, here is the kind of stuff that we're interested in. And once you've created that high-level decision architecture, if you want to call it, a simple way for an organization to say, this is what we're willing to sign up to, then everybody within the organization can actually go off and do what's necessary and create business cases that are bankable, that are based on the data, and where you can pull together all the pieces to make something happen. But I think that's where people should be spending 80% of their time. They need to get the point where most of the time goes into figuring out how to make change happen. I think right now, most people spend 90% of their time on the data and the analysis, and that ratio needs to shift as soon as possible.
Yeah, fantastic. Great point to end on there, I think. So we are just about out of time now, but I'd just like to close by saying thank you both very, very much to Cecily and to Karthik for joining us and for sharing your insights today. And yeah, thanks again to everyone who's joined us, watching as well. And please do go on to the iNetwork or the YPO Net Zero web pages, check out all the other sessions. We've got some great speakers and great topics lined up. So check those out and share the links and join the conversation on social media as well if you want it. So thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you very much.